Okay, so here we start the French Revolution, which is a revolution just like the Industrial Revolution. Revolutions obviously are things that are uh, basically initiated to change things. Um, and they, cause sometimes they happen organically, like the Industrial Revolution. That was just kind of a process that happened because of, we talk about the causes, right? The French Revolution is something that was intentional, where it happened as a result of people being economically exploited, mistreated, not feeling like they were being, part of the political process. And that's how the French Revolution kind of has its start. So again, two revolutions. One is an organic thing. In other words, it just kind of happened through the process of normal, interactions. Where the French Revolution was totally intentional, something that was done for a purpose. So the beginnings of the French Revolutions, we look at France prior to the French Revolution, which is 1789. So time framing, we're still around that same time period as the Industrial Revolution, are kind of happening around the same time, different parts of the world, obviously. France kind of is one of the most advanced countries throughout the mid 1700s. We'll talk about Napoleon a little bit, but in a different lecture. But anyways, it had a relatively large population, prosperous foreign trade, and it also was the center of the Enlightenment, which we talked about a little bit in the first semester, where the world made a transition. Europe really made a transition from the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, medieval times, feudalism, that kind of stuff, into a more knowledge-based period of time where people were much more educated, and they based their decisions on observations and reason and common sense, things of that sort. French society was divided up into three estates that happened in the 1750s. The first estate was primarily made up of clergy from the Roman Catholic Church. France was primarily Roman Catholic at that time. You could argue probably still is. And they owned about 10% of the land. They provided education and other services to the poor, contributed about 2% of the income. And so it was a pretty well-established part of French society. The second estate was made up of rich nobles. They accounted for about 2% of the population, so a relatively small portion of the population, but yet they controlled or owned 20% of the land and paid virtually no taxes because of their status within society. Even though it's a second estate, you could argue they were a little bit more politically influential than what the clergy might have been. And then lastly, you have what was referred to as the third estate. And these are, I'm sorry, I'm a little ahead of myself. The privileged estates, the first and second had all the privileges. They had access to high offices. They had some exemptions to paying taxes. And all these things were not granted to the third estate. You can see here in the little image or call it a graphic, I guess. It was an unequal society. The third estate was the about 80% of the population, and they paid almost 100%, if not 100% of the taxes. Whereas from an income standpoint, they brought in very little. They were relatively low paid. So not a good situation for the third estate. So the first and second estate were the privileged estates. All right, moving on to the third estate here. You can see, again, a graphic here that shows an old man here who's obviously from you see his pants are torn, and, and in the first and second estate here represented are kind of on his back. In other words, it's the work of the third estate that really provides, the financial and social status of the first and second estate. Again, a significant portion of the state, anywhere, around 90% of the population was lived within the third estate. And so, it wasn't a great situation. It was also subdivided into three different levels, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. You had the bourgeoisie, or the middle class. which were kind of the upper middle class, if you want to compare that to, modern day societies. They're bankers, factory owners, merchants, things of that sort, skilled artisans who made things. Um, they were relatively well educated, strongly rooted in the ideals of the Enlightenment. Um, and so they were somewhat influential, but again, still part of that third estate. Um, even though they were pretty influential, they still paid a significant portion of the taxes, and enjoyed virtually none of the privileges that the nobility enjoyed. Nobility was based on really your family lineage. If your family was, somewhat connected, to the ruling, establishment within France, then that's your status. Even though some of the bourgeoisie probably financially might have been a little bit more, had more money, they didn't have the political impact that the second estate has. So the bourgeoisie were the upper portion of the third estate. So the third estate also, you're talking about the working class, the urban workers. They were the poorest group. If we want to compare that to, medieval times, they were, maybe peasants. They were paid relatively low wages, frequently had problems feeding their families, and that's the basis of the revolution. When we get to that, came from this group. Like when, and that's just common sense, right? I mean, nobility and those who are benefiting from the way society is working is definitely not going to rise up and revolt against it because they're benefiting. It's these people who are not benefiting from the way society is set up in France. That's where the revolution is going to come from. So you have that, and you also have the fact that they have strength in numbers. They may not have financial strength, they might not have any political clout, but they do have a lot of people, and that's an advantage. And you'll see as we work through this, it becomes their advantage as we move on into the revolution itself. So forces of change, the growing resentment amongst the third estate, as I mentioned. You can see the graph here. You can see the third estate is the gray area here. They make up a significant amount of the population. They own a little bit of the land, about 2/3 of the land, but they pay 100% of the taxes. Where you see the second estate and the first estate pay no taxes at all. So you have the poorest group of individuals who are paying all the taxes, and that's where some of that resentment comes from. Other influences was the success of the American Revolution. We'll talk about the American Revolution towards the latter part of this unit, but the American Revolution inspired many Frenchmen or French citizens amongst the third estate to, kind of try to replicate what the Americans had done. It's a little different, right? The American Revolution was, American patriots revolting against British rule, whereas in the French Revolution, you're looking at citizens revolting against their own actual government within the country itself. The American Revolution was based on colonial relationship between Britain and the Americans. Second, serious economic problems, heavy burden of taxes. We mentioned, you can see 100% of the taxation. Being able to provide some financial stability to your family was virtually impossible because a great portion, if not all of your money that you might have generated through your work, and hard work, by the way, went to the government in forms of taxation. You might get a little bit, be able to, do a couple things, but nothing to make your life enjoyable. And then you throw in, they had some severe shortages of bread. Bread was the main, food source for French citizens at that time. And there was some crop failures. There was a drought. And so there was a reduced access to the main food source, which is bread. And so that, people can't eat, they can't feed their kids. And so that kind of also, so these are all motivations that kind of led to the uprising of the third estate and the revolution to start in France. So you had, some were inspired politically by the way the Americans were able to revolt and successfully conduct a revolution over the British. Then you had the fact that they were paying a significant amount of their own money in taxes. And then you had a lack of availability of food for a period of time due to the fact that, there was a drought and there was some crop failures, things of that sort. Continue on with the forces of change. This is all the events that lead up to the revolution itself. Serious economic problems. The heavy debt that was created by King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette. They, lived a very extravagant lifestyle. Marie Antoinette was famous for gowns that she wore that were, extremely expensive. And it wasn't a good look. It wasn't a good optic. The fact that, the third estate is struggling to feed their own kids while she's walking around in, gowns and these extravagant hairstyles that, were extremely expensive. And so that was not a good look for the French. By the 1780s, French bankers would not loan money to the government anymore because the government was not reliable in terms of paying it back, and because of the fact that the government was using it for this extravagant lifestyle. So they weren't using it to try to better society. They're using it for things that weren't necessary. Forces of change, weak and indecisive leadership. King Louis was not a strong leader. Obviously, we're talking about a hereditary monarchy, so wasn't elected. He just kind of ascended to the throne based on his family, right? And he didn't think that he had any political advisors that he trusted. He had really he didn't have a knack for governing. He was just there because he happened to be the next in line. And he used his position as king, you can see there in a picture, flowing gowns, extravagant type of gowns and worn clothes and things of that sort, which again was not a real good look for the people to see. Marie Antoinette also interfered and offered, he relied on her for political advice, which was obviously a big mistake. As a matter of fact, the French people mockingly referred to as Madame Deficit because of the amount of money that she was responsible for the government spending. And again, that's why the banks would no longer pay or offer loans to the government, because the government was being irresponsible with the money that they were getting. King Louis XVI, as a result of a crisis, economic crisis within the country, calls the Estates General, which had not been called in a couple hundred years in France. And it's really a drastic move. And it's basically calling in the first and second estate to, really ask for help type of thing. Each one of those people might have voted on whatever proposal the king might have put out there. Maybe it's to increase taxes. Maybe it's to borrow money. Maybe it was to, who knows type of thing. But you're talking about the third estate could always be outvoted because each estate got one vote. So there was three estates. So, the first and second estate always voted together, and, they got 2 out of the 3 votes. In other words, everybody voted within the state itself, but when the estate went to the general, they got 1 vote based on what the other people voted on. So again, the first and second estate always kind of collaborated. They voted a way that would benefit them. The third estate obviously would vote against whatever that was, but they only had 1 vote, and it didn't really matter. The bourgeoisie, part of the third estate, insisted that all 3 estates would meet together. And this would give the third estate an advantage because you're talking about they have more numbers. So in other words, it would be, instead of 3 separate states and 3 separate votes, it would be 1 entire vote. Well, 80, 90, 93% of the population resided in the third estate. They would just win out based on the fact that there's more of them. And obviously the first and second estate are going, no, that's not going to happen, because they would get outvoted and everything. So that kind of set the stage for what we eventually get into here in a second with the revolution starting. The third estate, as a result of being kind of boycotted out of the, not boycotted, they were being shunned out of the voting process, they called what was referred to as the National Assembly. And these were elements of the third estate that joined together and started to draw up a new form of constitution. They wanted to abolish the monarchy the way it was and institute a constitutional government, very much like the United States had done. It was the first step towards the actual act of revolution. We're going to propose that a new government be instituted, that the monarchy be abolished, and a constitutional government be established. Again, based on the model that the United States had already established. The tennis court oath was an actual event that happened on a tennis court in the Palace of Versailles. And that's where the third estate met. That's where they drew up the new constitution that they had proposed. And they did get some buy-in from some members of the clergy and nobility, not a significant amount, but they did get some. And the new constitution was developed based on this tennis court oath that they drew up the constitution at this meeting. As a result, King Louis, obviously being threatened by this whole process, his government's being threatened, he orders his troops to gather outside the meeting to restore order, to abolish whatever decisions that were made in this group of the third estate. So now you have fighting, right? Now you have the revolution really coming to fruition. Most of the peasant class did not have access to arms. They didn't have money to buy them. But they also knew that there was a Bastille, was called the Bastille, which was like a castle, a former castle, where they knew that there were arms there. There were weapons stored there. And they stormed the Bastille to access those weapons so they could defend themselves against the monarchy's troops, against King Louis's troops that he called in. Eventually, the mob is able to overrun the Bastille. They take access to the arms. So now you have the third estate, who has a significant advantage in terms of population. And now they have weapons, and now you have a problem for King Louis and his troops. Today, in France, Bastille Day is a national holiday. It's very, very similar to what 4th of July would be in the United States. And it really signifies, there isn't really like a one event that starts the revolution, but this is the single event that kind of triggers what the revolution eventually becomes. And there's a different series of revolutions that occur. There's different governments that are implemented, and they are overthrown, and it gets really complicated here in a little bit. I'll try to simplify it as much as I can, but it's a complex process, the French Revolution. Women, October, March, women protesting high prices, scarcity of bread. They riot in the marketplace, which is where all the trading of goods take place, the marketplace, right? And they head towards the king's palace. And they are joined by some men. It was originally just women who grabbed spears and whatever, clubs and whatever they could access. And they were really going after Marie Antoinette. Obviously women can identify with that. The fact that, she would wear all these extravagant clothes and spend all this money, causing the country to go into deficit. Meanwhile, these women are trying to feed their children, and they can't because there's not enough access to that stuff. So that's kind of spurs on this whole process in October of 1789. Marquis de Lafayette was he was a significant individual. He was part of the National Guard that was part of the king's forces, but he was also well respected. He was a advisor to the American Revolution as well. Matter of fact, he trained and fought along with some other French troops during the Revolution in the Americas. And he was able to kind of restore order because he had a little bit of, street cred, I guess, with the Third Estate. So he kind of got everybody to calm down for the most part. But obviously it starts to escalate here in a little bit. But as far as the Women's October March, he was able to get everything down, calmed down, and controlled. The end of the monarchy, as more and more nobles and clergy start to join the Third Estate in terms of their political ideals. The commoners, the whole process becomes a challenge to the monarchy, and the monarchy is basically ended. The revolution successfully ends the monarchy for a period of time. So that's where we'll end on this. We'll pick up what happens with what happens eventually to King Louis and Marie Antoinette. But that just gives you a background information on the kind of the steps that lead up to the revolution. And then we'll do some other lecture outlines a little bit later on the actual revolution and what occurred and some of the events and things of that sort. So you also have your video lesson that you're working on that I posted as well. So the video lesson kind of takes you a little bit further into the revolution. It also talks about some of the stuff that we did in this lecture as well. So you should be working on that. So both of those are posted on Google Classroom. Other than that, if you have any questions, just let me know.